Good morning. I'd like to welcome everybody to our next session at the SDG studio. Such a pleasure to be here, and we're very, very pleased to welcome to our stage Thomas Gass, who is the Assistant Secretary General for Policy Coordination and Interagency Affairs at DESA. So we've had a fascinating session here at the EDDs this year, and yesterday a very impassioned session with the SDG Advocates as well. So the first question I'd like to ask you is, how would you summarize the key messages coming out of the SDG Advocates here at the EDDs?
Well, first, thank you very much for having me here on this awesome media zone, and Laura Christine. Yes, yesterday we had a really interesting panel with 7 strong advocates, because Queen Mathilde kicked it off, no? And then you had Frank Timmermans, who joined us with a very passionate plea for the importance of the universality of the Sustainable Development Goals and the way the goals are interconnected. That was really encouraging for us to hear. But then it was interesting. I was expecting a panel. I mean, the panel was on what changes are necessary to ensure that no one is left behind. And so I was expecting a discussion that was more about the technical issues. You know, do you actually know who the most vulnerable are in your society? You know, do you have the instruments that give you that disaggregated data that you need? Are our development strategies systematically building resilience, you know, of the most vulnerable and shifting the burden from the development side to the humanitarian side? Those kinds of responses. But no, the responses on this panel were much more about, do we have the right attitude? Do we actually believe that these goals can be achieved? Are we ready to do what it takes? Are we ready to be the change that we want to see happen? And so the messages, one after the other, was about from these really convincing and powerful advocates who have themselves, you know, changed things in their lives. I mean, take Lema Bowie. I mean, in a peace process in Liberia, Jeffrey Sachs, he's been rooting for more funding for aid for as long as I can remember, you know. And you have really strong advocates there, and who are telling you, wait a minute, or Paul Polman, you know, CEO of Unilever. You would have expected something technical from him. No. He said, we need to change the way our society sees things. The golden rule, you know, do to others what you want them to do to you. That came from Paul Polman, a CEO of Unilever. So very, very encouraging, very much a panel that went to the fundamentals. And I think that was the kind of messages that needed to be heard here in the European Development Days.
Absolutely. I completely agree. And when it comes to inspiration, we have to get to the fundamentals of humanity behind this agenda. And on the more political side, I wonder, with the HLPF coming up and a couple of years into the agenda, how you're feeling with respect to continuing this momentum. We've got a long agenda ahead of us. We face this problem in the SDG Action Campaign too. We've got these political moments, but how do we keep the momentum going? How do you feel about the number of governments that are choosing to report, for instance? How do we keep that up throughout the agenda?
It's a very good question, and you mentioned the HLPF. It's the high-level political forum. It's the place every year where member countries of the UN come and report on what they are doing to implement these goals. And this is an important moment. And last year we had 22 countries. This year we have 44 countries. Belgium is part of one of those. And Alexander De Croo, who was just on this panel a few moments ago, is going to be presenting what his country is doing in terms of helping the developing countries, but also in terms of what it has to do to achieve the goals internally, and in terms of the policy coherence. So this is a really important mechanism. In addition to that, of course, we, as the UN, and this is a stand here that is animated by all the UN agencies, well, they each have a role, you know, in bringing together the statistics that feed into what we call the Sustainable Development Goals Progress Report, which is an annual report that will tell us not just where the 17 goals are and the 169 targets, but the 232 indicators that are actually underpinning the targets. So those are going to be monitored across all the countries, and that data is coming together. Obviously, that's a huge job, and it'll take some time to get a really granular picture, but it's really important. So we have the statistics, we have individual countries, then we have important intergovernmental forums that are bringing their assessment from a thematic point of view. I mean, for example, the Human Rights Council writes every year an input to the high-level political forum to say, from a human rights perspective, how are we doing on the goals? The World Trade Organization, the World Health Assembly, the Committee on World Food Security, all these thematic spaces. Now, that gives a pretty good picture at a global level, but that's not enough to maintain the momentum. If we want the momentum to be maintained, then the accountability has to shift. This is not your run-of-the-mill, top-down program. This is a program that has to be pushed from the bottom. The Sustainable Development Goals are based on interviews with more than 5 million individuals, and those 5 million individuals must see that things are changing. And so what is important is not so much the review or the reporting of each country in the UN in New York, but how they report every year to their own people. This downward, inward accountability. The Sustainable Development Goals have to become a social contract between the leaders and their people. If they don't become that, they're not going to happen. So that's where the momentum is going to happen. And that was also mentioned yesterday evening on that panel.
So how do we get there? Thinking about, it's a UN agenda. Yes, we're successfully rallying the UN system. We're rallying governments. They're very committed. But how do we reach out to the ordinary people? And what are your key messages for people out there who are looking to get involved actively in the implementation or the promotion of the SDGs?
Well, there's a lot that everyone can do. But the best thing, the very practical thing that I say to everyone is start by clicking on the goals. It's not just 17 goals. The 17 goals are proxies. You click on them. There are 169 targets. This is the small script of the social contract. You need to know what's written there. And then you go through the 169 target. It takes a little bit of time, but it's worth it because you will see very, very relevant things for you and things where you can make a difference. And then you start deciding what you can do to change, how to rally, how to build your partnerships to actually push the needle on the one or other target. So that's really important. Then what we just said is hold your leaders accountable, because after all, the executive in your country, at your sub-regional level, your municipality, they're responsible, you know. So hold them accountable to it. But walk the talk, be the change.
Fabulous. Thank you very much for taking the time to be with us here today in your busy schedule. It's such a pleasure to have you. We'll be posting this video and sharing widely. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Laura Christina.